working.
This one works? Good. So, thank you, Susanne Nikoltchev, for this introduction. I moved over here because this will be the place where we will discuss for the next 1 hour and a half with distinguished speakers and panelists our topic of today. We have two buzzwords, convergence and disintermediation. What I would really hope is that when we will leave this room at 3 o'clock sharp, we will have a closer clue, both from the market point of view and from the legal one. And in order to guide us through the history of convergence, how services manage to exploit technological means and opportunities and develop from closed managed networks to the open internet-driven services we are all benefit from, we will have two keynote introductions. I will introduce our distinguished speakers in a very short while. We will have a panel discussion with 4 important players from different industry sectors: Netflix, Sky, a regulator, and a producer from Scala Productions, and I will introduce them very shortly. We will then discuss for approximately an hour, but I would ask you to be prepared for the Q&A session. This is as important as the rest of the conference, so just raise your hands, take notes, feel involved. This is not just a conference between us here on the stage, but it's going to be something very interactive. So to give you a feeling of our distinguished panelists, I would like to ask Colin Wardner to join me on the stage. Colin is Director of Global Public Policy of Netflix. I'm sure Netflix does not need any introduction, and the same applies also for Sky. So I would ask Daniel Friedlander to also come up on the stage. Daniel is head of the EU office of Sky here in Brussels, and I would like him to join me here on my right-hand side. These 2 gentlemen will be joined by 2 more gentlemen, so I will weigh up the quota issue. I will count for 6. So Bernardo Herman, he represents the regulators, and he is Director General of the Belgian CSA. And then we have from Scala Productions, Nick Powell. He is a producer and partner of Scala Productions, and there is small steps over there, so you can join us on Bernardo's left-hand side. These 4 gentlemen will be involved in an energetic discussion on market, legal perspectives on convergence and disintermediation. So what I would suggest is that we have 2 rounds, at least. One starting with the impulses from Gilles, and then we move on to the regulatory part. So my first spontaneous question is, since we have industry representatives, and Colin, for example, let's start with you. Do you recognize yourself in this picture? Do you think that some of these examples are somehow applying to Netflix reality, or do you see it elsewhere on the market? Don't you see it at all? How is your perspective here?
Okay, well, first I'm going to try with the microphone and then without. And want some feedback from the audience about
with.
Okay. Yeah, I recognize a lot of Netflix's business in Gilles' presentation, and I think it's an interesting debate about what is this current phase of convergence and what is this current phase of disintermediation. And we don't have a complete perspective at Netflix, but I think my perspective is slightly different. And having gone through what I would call Convergence 1.0, to use some now dated terminology, but Convergence 1.0 would be the combination of telecom and managed pay TV networks, so cable, satellite, and then IPTV. The entire debate in Convergence 1.0, from my perspective, was about many of the points that Alexander brought up. What is the new regulatory framework that makes sense for a converged environment, where you have not just 1 or maybe 2 competitors in a market offering package pay TV options, but you now have more options. So this increased competition led to discussions all around the world that are still ongoing about deregulation and liberalization. I think we're in a second phase of convergence, and we can call it Convergence 2.0, which is convergence between channels and OTT providers. And so the two people that are coming together are the people who are packaging channels and selling them to Sky or Deutsche Telekom through various intermediaries, and OTT services either operating direct to consumer or also in partnership with traditional providers, also providing a curated selection of content that they're making available. And I think one of the points that you brought up is something that really resonates with me and my experience in the business, which is content. The channels that are being most successful right now are the ones who have compelling content that they can differentiate themselves, and investment is only increasing. So whether it's Time Warner and HBO, they're going to continue to be successful because they have a team that can produce very compelling, globally competitive content. And so these market shifts, while they are shifting their business models in response, fundamentally they know how to make great content and tell great stories. And the slide that Gilles put up, showing all of these different companies, many of them I know are increasing their investment in original programming to maintain that differentiation. And that's exactly what we had to do. When we were a younger business, but we were in the over-the-top video business, we were licensing content to make it available to consumers. And as more and more market entrants came, we saw more people offering over-the-top services. We had to fight harder and harder to differentiate ourselves and to make our service compelling, and also to essentially compete with the changed market reality. All of a sudden, licensing VOD rights was something that was expensive. So we differentiated ourselves by going into original programming, by making something that we could have exclusively, and that we could build our brand around. And so that was House of Cards. We actually started earlier with smaller projects, but that was the biggest project for the markets that we were in then. And now we continue to make that investment. So I see a lot of what Gilles' presentation outlined in our business. I think, though, that I could talk about the second phase of convergence, the phase of convergence that we're in now, as more applications and channels, and less some of the other ways that you can divide up the market. But as I said, I'm only one part of the ecosystem.
Since you said Convergence 2.0 between channels and over-the-top providers, and now I look at you, Daniel. If you're a channel and Netflix is an over-the-top provider, audiovisual media service, of course, but you don't own your network, whereas Sky, of course, is always also somehow involved in the satellite part. How do you recognize yourself in here? Are you best friends or best enemies?
Well, first, thank you. It's good to be here, and if you called on us to be enemies, I think you might be a little disappointed, because I think on a lot, I mean, what it's really about at the end of the day, first of all, is having the great content that people want and finding the best way to get it to them. So yes, in some countries we have satellite, now we've done IPTV, we also have pure over-the-top services, a bit like Netflix, although what we have that's different is we also have linear channels on top of the VOD. So basically it's just about how do you adapt your product to fit the consumer need in that country, because it is quite different often. How do you create the best content, whether it's yourself, whether it's in a co-production, to then, you know, give them what they want. You know, all the examples you gave are examples that I think we can subscribe to. We've also just done an international co-production deal with HBO, specifically to continue to meet these deals. We launch completely different products in different countries to do that. And funnily enough, when I was looking at Gilles' slide with all the different steps, it goes back to what Alexander, you were saying, where we are actually quite fully integrated in the sense that as much as possible now, what I see within the company is that all those steps are happening within Sky. So, you know, we're creating the content, we're distributing, we have the networks, we have the consumer relationship, we have the hardware in their homes down to the remote control. We're looking how you can integrate with other pieces of hardware to make it easier for the consumer to access everything and use everything. So it's very positive developments, but I would say now we're even beyond you know, 2.0, and we're in something different now where it's really coming together in a very good sort of offer for consumers through our platforms. We're bringing in even sort of quasi-competitors sometimes to have access. You know, it's a very good place to be in, And for me, the threat is more on the regulatory side, or on the, let's call it the level playing field side, and what comes next, both on the deregulation side and on probably for once, and you know, I haven't been known to say this often, but actually on the need maybe to regulate a little bit more in some places, but I'm sure we'll get to that.
We will get back to that, absolutely. But you basically killed all the intermediaries, no, by doing everything yourself. Isn't this in a nutshell what you've been doing?
I guess that really depends on what your definition of an intermediary is.
Exactly.
But the fact is that if some companies don't evolve and don't find the best way to keep in touch with their consumers, then yes, they will be bypassed, or you know, with all that choice that's available, they'll choose other things, whether it's us, whether it's them, whether it's both. I mean, you have that choice.
Yeah, and indeed that was also both in Alexander's and Jim's presentation, the issue of the full integration, stakeholders governance, so we will also get back to that. But now I look at Nick, because I understood, yeah, I give your name so that you can take your mic. I think there is one here, or you have, yeah. Content is more and more important, if I understand from what both Daniel and Colin said. And being you producer, and Scala Productions has, I mean, quite a name on how do you see your future here? Is this
beneficial? In this room.
Sorry?
Don't worry.
Do you see benefits, risks, challenges?
Yeah. I just want to take the conversation back to your headline. You know, what challenged me, apart from the fact that Eurostar still doesn't have plugs or Wi-Fi, so streaming Netflix or Sky is... yeah, as you go through the tunnel, but it reappears on the other side.
The Wi-Fi blocks content.
Oh, okay. Terrible, yeah. No, absolutely. No, my thing was the use of the word middleman. Two objections, really. One is man,
Thank
as opposed to middle person. But secondly, I'm sort of suspicious of the use of this English word, when I think a French word would have, which is used and indeed pronounced in French in English, if you get my meaning, replaced it, and you said entrepreneur, because entrepreneur, of course, this is my schoolboy French, I left school at 16, but, you know, I always understood entre meant between, and preneur meant to take, came from prendre, to take, and if you replace the word middleman with the word entrepreneur, I think at the very least, following President Macron's speech yesterday, you would have a very different reception. In other words, if it was an attempt to cut out the entrepreneur, and I don't just mean the business entrepreneur, I also mean the cultural entrepreneur, the people like myself, and there are many much better than me, and bigger and smaller, and more effective, but these are the people who pull together the conditions under which that great content, whether it's made by Warner Brothers, Sky, Netflix, is made. That's what we do, is pull together the teams, the stories, the writers, the directors, and of course, what we are concerned about is, we love it at the moment because there's all these additional platforms. Many of them, as I was saying earlier, where the gatekeepers are actually people I used to know in the 80s who clearly extended their careers and salaries. And many of them in their 70s. One I thought was dead, actually. But not the case. But that was my point that, so obviously right now it's great. If it leads to a situation where the number of gatekeepers becomes much smaller, i.e. a limited number of corporations employing a small number of gatekeepers, then obviously for producers, and indeed for all content makers, this is bad news. At the moment we have the old, we have the new, and it's, as Kai was saying, that's a great situation for any producer of content to be in. So I would, that would be, you know, my main point. There are new models. There's eCinema in France, which is a cinema-style release, but across a platform. I'm sure others will go where they went with that. And I think there's a misunderstanding also because, okay, you know, Netflix makes its it says own content. Yes, it owns it. It's exclusive to Netflix, same at Sky, same at Warner Brothers, but they don't actually make it. You know, it is made by the likes, not of myself and thousands of others across Europe. And I just saw a Hungarian film last night, Body and Soul, a wonderful Palestinian film the night before. And these are all of the result of people risking their livelihoods to put together content that people clearly want to see, because in every case those cinemas were full, and that was on the old media. And they'll probably go home and watch Sky or Netflix or one of the platforms and see, hopefully, other content that actually we have made.
Yeah, no, this is an important point, because indeed to own content doesn't necessarily mean that you own more than you own the rights. So do you actually make the content? That's but then we can come back to it. Maybe we want to react on this, because you say original content, but is original content actually produced content? Do you buy the content? Is it commissioned content? I think that's maybe also beneficial for the audience to hear this point, since Nick raised this, and then it might also be helpful for Bernardo to come back on this from the regulatory side. When you say Netflix original, what is that?
I guess I couldn't agree more that Netflix can help creative talent, artists realize their vision, but we are a producer in the financial and supportive sense, and there's a huge community of artists that are deeply involved and committed and put in the incredible work to bring every production that's on our service to life. So I in no way meant to say that we were internalizing all of that creative energy. That's something that exists in the world, and I think entrepreneur is a good way to think about many of the producers in this space, so I welcome that word. So I only really agree with what you said, and so when I talk about owned originals or our original content, it's really talking about this is something that we pre-finance, we fully finance, we have the exclusive rights to, and so we helped on the financial side and the development side, but so many artists went into every one of those films and series.
And that applies to Sky as well?
We do make some of it ourselves internally, fully, but most of the time it is indeed whether it's the idea comes from us or from one of the independent producers or one of the writers. I think we work with around 300 independent producers across Europe right now, and they are the lifeblood of the European film and television sector. None of us would be able to create what we finance and what we think of without them. And that's also why on some of the regulatory challenges we are so close together to try to make sure that this very healthy market stays healthy. And I mean, you just put out a report earlier this week on the broadcasting regulation. That is, for example, one of those cases where, you know, the different productions, co-productions that we either finance, take part in, or even do ourselves and then sell, you know, that is one of the areas where it's at risk, and that doesn't matter what kind of system you're going to use to get to your consumer. I think that is one of the big risks there.
If I could just add one other point, there's another word which I would use to describe, you know, what you're calling the middleman, and that is, this is a slightly sexist word, midwives.
Okay, wow.
Because producers are midwives of new talent. Normally the studios in the world, and including Netflix and Amazon in that, have to deal with established talent so they can depend that the quality of the content is going to be to the standard they require. Someone has to develop that talent when it is still in the womb, when it is emerging, when it is just getting its profile. Someone has to spot that, develop it, make it, write it, etc.
Yeah, sure.
So that's also, you know, what we do. I mean, maybe mid-husbands would be, or mid, I don't know, people, but midwives anyway.
Okay, well, noted. Now, Bernardo, since regulation now has been mentioned indirectly by everyone, how important is it for you to really know how all this works? This is more a market perspective, of course, but to know all the dynamics, how relevant is this in order to regulate well?
First, thank you for inviting me among those distinguished representatives of the industry. I came with some bodyguards in the room here, so but I feel safe.
But that's good.
So
always safe with
it is really important for me, for us as regulator, to understand, of course, what is behind those technological evolutions. And actually there is also a demand from the sector in our country to have exchanges, and we are organizing conferences on this evolution, the digital evolution, just to understand what is meaningful when you are regulating a market, if you need to keep regulating this market. I would say that I would join and support my colleagues from the panel in the idea that, of course, disintermediation is bringing a lot of benefits for consumers. It means more services, more choices. It means prices drops. If, of course, you don't need to replace the ancient intermediaries by too much new intermediaries. Now, from a regulator point of view, of course, we do believe that the whole society is benefiting from these developments as long as all the players are actually respecting the rules of the game, the rules of our ecosystem. This word has been mentioned as well. And maybe you could have a reflection on whether you need to keep these rules in the ecosystem. Where I have problems, as regulator is when some people from the ecosystem are following the rules, respecting the rules, while others get a free ride, of course.
But because the rules don't apply to them, or because they infringe them? Because then it's your fault. Then you should sanction them.
Both.
Okay.
Both. But let's say that when you see that actually the regulatory framework is not fit for purpose, then of course you need to adapt it, and you have to make some proposals to live with those challenges. We have two main cases, I would say, where we are facing some big challenges. The first one is when local rules are not taken into consideration or may not be taken into consideration. It means that when players consider they do not have to respect the rules of the market that they are targeting, for example.
So local, you mean the national rules?
Yes.
The country of destination, basically.
Country of destinations, yes. What if, of course, a service is targeting your territory, has a significant impact on the market, is collecting the same revenues from the advertising sector, because of course there are strong links between both. A lot of things are financed by advertising, but when they still pretend that they should not comply with the rules of your ecosystem, then of course you have a problem. The country of origin principle is always the shelter which is claimed for not applying the rules. A second case is when the concept of editorial responsibility is vanishing, and it has been mentioned by Alexander. There are questions, is it still important? There is a loss of central authority. This is the situation that we have with video sharing platforms, mainly hosting, of course, user-generated content. These platforms play a role, notably in organizing the videos, in sending recommendations to users, and by the way, as you know, they are collecting big money from the advertising sector. This money is not reinvested in the production of content, but they still find a shelter behind the concept of mere transport, which is enshrined in the e-commerce directive, as you know, and which has not been opened for review by the Commission. Yes, it is, in both cases we are concerned. That's the least that I can say. And actually, each time that a stakeholder which is playing a significant role in the audiovisual sector finds a shelter for not respecting those rules of the ecosystem,
then we have a problem. These rules, because I have the impression that you are future-looking, no? I mean, or is it really already the case?
Actually,
and then maybe if you want to react as well, no? But just to make this clear, so
in the French-speaking zone of Belgium, we have 8 VOD services which are notified with our regulator, and we have 20 web TVs. So, but these are established locally, and we have no problem with
locally
them.
in Belgium?
Yes, in Belgium. So, now of course we have bigger problem with, of course, US-based companies and among others. Then of course you can think that the regulation should be rethink. Then of course we have to contribute to the debate on the review of the aviation.
So to summarize, if I get you correctly, you see two holes basically. One is the one of targeting services, not abiding by the local rules of the country of destination, and the other one is the subjects that don't have editorial responsibility, but they are not here basically because they do both respect the rules, no? Also, yes? Say yes?
But the starting point is that you always have to question whether you need to keep regulation or not, of course. But it depends on how strong you feel that the democratic values need to be supported and defended. And actually no one dared to tell me, okay, you know, pluralism is not interesting at all, protection of minors neither. So, you know, this is obvious.
So that's what Uberization means, companies who do not comply with local regulations.
See, yeah, that's the question. I mean, obviously when we enter a market, we comply by the rules and we respect them. A few days ago, obviously, since we're using this Uberization, Uber got, at least soon to be banned by Transport for London. And then the first thing they did was launch a petition. And so, you know, I use Uber and I got an email saying, oh, join the petition. And I wrote back saying, well, sure, petition, but what about just following the rules? I'm still waiting for an answer, but I think that's a valid question in this new economy and reality that we're in. Again, last week the Prime Minister of Estonia was speaking, very liberal, forward-thinking country, and he said as well, the competitive advantage between companies cannot be between the ones who pay taxes and who don't. You know, these are fairly simple things that until recently were taken as a given, and it's true that the culture of entrepreneurship, which has created so much good, has also created these new questions. And for me, there are clearly areas in which less regulation is a good thing. There are probably areas in the Belgian regulation where if it were simplified a bit, it would help for a company like us to enter it, because it is rather complex in many cases when you do want to respect the rules.
I'm open for questions.
We'll talk later.
What would you open up?
But no, I mean, the key for me is, and maybe it has been released while we've been sitting here, maybe not, but the whole platform communication, right? Because that's a key one when you consider that a lot of these players are entering or acting in exactly the same space as the rest of us, but not playing by the same rules. So then that does create a very strange environment where we're following rules, we're investing, we're returning the money, we're paying our taxes, which should not be, you know, so important to keep repeating, but it has become the case. And then we're competing against people who aren't, and sometimes they just aren't following the rules. Sometimes they know that if they don't, it'll take years to catch up to them, and other times it's a sort of willful choice to claim that they're not covered. That is a difficult environment, and I don't just say for me, I say for any of the companies operating in the space. And that for me is the big question, I guess, of our time. Do we want to responsibilize the actors online, especially when, as Nick said, there's a good chance that over time the number will dwindle and some will get even bigger. And that's the big question. And you know, I work for a company that hasn't traditionally looked at more regulation, but in this field, it's definitely something that I'm looking at. How can you use the regulation to actually create that level playing field, which will be beneficial, I think, for all of us, whether it's us or you guys and the consumer in the end.
But which rules do you think are extendable to these platforms? Because for the moment under review, what is being discussed are rules on protection of minors, hate speech, so the protection rules. Bernardo mentioned pluralism, which is of course also an important value. Which of the rules that are not currently in the revision directive do you think should, in case, be extended?
Well, I mean, actually, there are a lot. From my point of view, there are a lot of different rules and a lot of different directives or communications that could be extended. I mean, if we start with what's already open, from my point of view, some of the extra sort of even non-binding requirements on AVMS, on video sharing platforms, that's an interesting step, you know, even though I think it's a bit weak. In copyright, the value gap, whether you like it or not, I think the basic principle of it is that if someone is using someone else's content, they should be paying a fair price to the creator for that content. I mean, these are, you know, good principles at a high level. If we look at platform communication, notice and takedown, it's very simple. If someone is operating in the same space and you know, using content, then there needs to be a simple, efficient, fast way to take that content down, whether it's hate speech, whether it's terrorism, or whether it's, for want of a better word, the pirate content. These are important principles. Then if you look further, then you go into more deregulation stuff, and it is a strange juxtaposition, but the goal of both would be to have that level playing field and have people competing in the same world.
We are now so lucky that Alexander is also Deutsche Telekom, so he is somehow our elephant in the room. You are the bad guy here, aren't you? But you are...
I work at Deutsche Telekom.
Yeah?
Must be some sort of convergence where we have not come to.
But you wanted to say something, I think. Yeah.
Thanks. First of all, you did the sort of, please raise your hands if there's an intermediate on the panel. I would claim that Deutsche Telekom is an intermediate in many instances.
As are we.
As you are. The question underlying was whether we assume editorial responsibility. In most instances, I would say no. Yeah. If you look at what we already have as platform regulation, must carry regime, for example, there the national legislator and the regulator tell us what kind of content must be on our platform. So in this respect, there is little room for proper own genuine editorial decisions to be taken by us. There are none. Yeah? For the rest of the service, of course, you could say that is our decision with whom, with what kind of TV broadcast or with what kind of VOD service provider we are willing to contract and to put them on the platform and to allow access and make access more easy for consumers via our platform. For access services, I wouldn't claim that we have autonomy responsibility over that.
Imagine.
So there's a whole spectrum, and I would like to keep that in mind. With must carry, you could say, well, what is the best solution now? Talking about level playing field. Do we want to maintain must carry as a concept? Is there a need for it? I would say in most markets in Europe, no. But it's so familiar, it will not be abandoned, I'm afraid. So what it looks like right now in the review, in the upcoming EECC, European Electronic Communications Code, is that you have an expansion of the existing rules towards platform services, which are independent of infrastructure. So if you will attach in the future, in order to attain a level playing field, you will attach some must-carry obligations also to service providers. That is some sort of answer which I would ask to rethink again before enacting. But that's one example. Value gap, the so-labeled value gap, I'm insisting to call it. The value gap is something which might be present in some instances. And a company was named, and a product of the company was named where you could think about that. True. But there's a reason, because we have the e-commerce directive as it stands, and we have concepts from copyright as they stand. If I'm not communicating something to the public, I'm not responsible for that. So we have to think it like 360 degrees a little bit in order to see really where we can tackle the issue. The value gap might be between a producer and a cameraman, a costumes tailor, or whatever it might be more down the road. So if you think of attaching some sort of contract adjustment procedure in order to mitigate possible shortcomings, you must be very clear on how the market functions, and then you must invent rules or devise rules which really are fit for the kind of purpose. What I'm seeing now in the copyright directive does not look to me like being fit to addressing the issue of the value gap.
Article 13, you mean?
No, farther beyond, 14 to 16. Because that is also something which belongs to the discussion on is there a value gap. Yeah? Being quite remote from what has been negotiated upstream as a platform provider, as an aggregator, we are really concerned what kind of bureaucracy we will be facing in a couple of years when being asked whether we paid sufficient monies to the TV broadcaster in order that the TV broadcaster pays sufficient monies to the producer in order for the producer. Thanks.
Well, the money goes somewhere, so this will be interesting. So everyone should think about the issue of the revenues, but Bernardo asked me to intervene, and then I will ask you to react, and then maybe, Gilles, you want to give your impression on how the functioning is working. Bernardo.
So just to come back again on this editorial responsibility concept, two quick points. The first is that actually it has not been defined yet. What is an editorial decision? It has not been defined, and actually we do believe that, of course, these are decisions taken on day-to-day basis, in particular by program directors and editors-in-chief and so on. It should be confirmed, because if you are not defining that, you will let the idea that flying, that actually this decision could be taken by people working occasionally in different member states, and actually those decisions are made by people working in a specific premise. So it should be confirmed. The second concern is that actually you mentioned, Alexander, that there are a lot of new entities without editorial responsibility, which is true. But actually it does not prevent attaching some obligations to those entities. It is the case of all Belgian distributors, but it is the same in France, it is the same in Germany, call it e-communication platforms. In the Netherlands they have something similar. So I would think that of course it is important to impose obligations to people playing a big role in this audiovisual sector. It would be better for the ecosystem.
Okay, yeah. Clear. You wanted to react? I think you, no?
Yeah,
and then Nick, you...
I was just going to actually ask Daniel, because obviously one of the big issues for producers, especially film producers, is the attack on territoriality, which you briefly referred to.
I was, doubting if I should pronounce it.
But I was doubting, and I was worried. But I don't know if is it still in court? Is it?
There's that, but I can't talk about that.
Yeah.
There's the broadcasting regulation, SATCA, which I'm always happy to talk about.
Good.
But that's another conference, isn't it?
Yes and no, because it does have a big impact on everything we're talking about here. You know, it's a bit like these big principles of online responsibility, or if you're making money off content, then you should be contributing back. If the territoriality question goes badly in the Parliament and in the Council, and we are, for example, no longer able to do co-productions, then that's a huge chunk of money that gets gobbled up out of the European sort of ecosystem. It's a very, very bad thing. At the end of the day, that's obviously not what most of the sector wants. And so I would urge anyone who cares about that to really focus again on broadcasting regulation to make sure that it doesn't sort of damage all of us. But it comes back to sort of the value gap again.
About value gap, just a curiosity, Colin, do you share Daniel's, this position on the self-cab regulation? Is that so? Because you should be happy, no? That you can.
No.
How is it?
I can't tell you how much of my time I spend correcting that. That you actually asked for the microphone in order to try and describe how similar our investment models are to what Sky just outlined. So for many of our exclusives in many territories, in another territory, they did not premiere on Netflix, but we brought them exclusively to another territory. So in fact, our the first series that was labeled a Netflix original in the United States was a show that we co-produced with NRK in Norway. And that model has been very successful because you'll have an established broadcaster, an established distribution network that's very highly penetrated in the market, and they need to figure out how to complete that budget. And so we come in and we say, we'll buy the rights for 27 EU member states, so it'll premiere in one member state, and then we'll carry it everywhere else on a first-run basis. Very, very similar basic co-production model. The only difference is, I think the set of rights that Sky buys and the set of rights that we buy when we're working with those producers are slightly different sets of rights. Because Sky is highly penetrated in some markets and we are less penetrated in those, and so we're probably on the opposite sides of that table. And in fact, we've done a little bit of work like that with Sky Italia and others.
And then I wanted to ask you, Nick, afterwards we can think about it. Do you win more with or without territoriality? Think about it. Jill?
Yes, just one remark and leaving just for 1 second the regulatory debate and looking a little bit forward. What seems striking to me that, as it was clearly explained both by Colin and Daniel, content is one of the key competitive advantage for the future services. There is another one, to me, and that's clearly technology. I think among the many examples which have been given of disintermediation, maybe the main disintermediator is technology itself. And it's important to keep in mind because I don't think that television was such a technology-intensive business like 15 or 20 years ago. I guess it's changing, and I guess that it may be one of the key criteria of competitiveness of the companies in the market. And one of the questions to me also is which of the traditional broadcasting companies will have the resources to be competitive in such in a market where, again, mastering technology to me seems much more important than it used to be. So content, but maybe content and technology as two key aspects of the future companies, but to be discussed.
I think it's a really interesting point. Netflix, our roots are really as a technology company. So if you go back to when we were just licensing content and really starting out in the B2B space, we were differentiated on the fact that we're on any device, that it's anytime you want, so any screen on demand, those sorts of aspects, and also the picture quality. All of those added up to our consumer proposition. Our consumer proposition has shifted to being more and more about content. And so I think it's an interesting point to bring up technology. And I think the contrasting example to us might be HBO, which HBO arrived in the Convergence 2.0 world with amazing world-leading content, but they had to build out the technology for this next transformation. And part of that effort, in fact, is using a company called MLB Advanced Media, or Emblem. They provide a lot of the technology foundation to HBO's products, and it's this great partnership. But you can almost think of them as a new kind of intermediary, where you have these firms that are helping provide the content programmers. I'm gonna step a little bit away from producers, mindful of Nick's comment about the key role that independent producers play in the ecosystem.
Yeah, no,
and so there might be an emerging new intermediary as more and more of these channels transition to new services where they're going to outsource some of their technology, some of their UI, that allows them to get scale. So we had to pioneer a lot of them, but it might be in this next wave of new services There will be some in-house, some that come from firms like Deutsche Telekom, which is a technology leader around the world, and some that are coming from these new independent firms.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said, and I wouldn't get hung up on technology. You know, we do a lot of it in-house, we work with partners. The key is just, it's an enabler for the content and for the rest. If you don't measure up, then you will have a problem. But it's just a tool. And if you can master the tool and you have the content, then you can go forward. You know, I really would place content first, whether it's your own, whether it's acquired, or it's what people want. Then what, you know, we have a lot of these different things. We'll use satellite signal, we'll use IPTV, we'll use over the top, we'll use anything as long as we give the consumer what they want. And that's the key. And then if you look also at other sort of gaps in the market, technology helps to fill it, but it's just again an enabler. So you know, if certain content isn't licensed, we use a partner called TRX that helps partners identify how to buy and sell content that traditionally wouldn't have a high enough value to be worth a lot of the smaller broadcasters or distributors in different countries to go through the process. It's an enabler again. It's a very positive enabler. Just like for any Germans in the room, Pantaflix is another service that, for example, will sell direct to the consumer content that isn't licensed in their country. It's an enabler, it's a tool, it's a very positive one.
So yeah, I just wanted Nick before and then I come back to you.
I was just going to...
Needed, Nick. That's the message from today. Yeah, they all want you. That's nice.
I know, my girlfriend didn't say that, but... you know, territoriality, you know, I think of nothing else, and nor do my colleagues, you know, across Europe. I mean, to use Alexander's analogy about the algorithm determining a sex scene after 8 minutes, clearly that algorithm has not visited the UK. But it is absolutely fundamental to current funding. Maybe there will be different funding models in the future, but they're not there now. So the attack on territoriality and rights is absolutely fundamental to the survival of all feature film producers. Not sure about TV producers, but certainly all feature film producers. And their ability to midwife talent and build and make great content that then these distributors can do. And I'm shocked actually that the Commission has gone on for so long attacking territoriality and its rights on some kind of Thatcherite free market. Consumers are, you know, consumers have always been in charge. They've always voted with their feet. They've always not paid for services that they don't want. You know, we don't need this. It's kind of pre-1.0 internet thinking.
Clear. Bernardo, you wanted to intervene, and then I think we are quite ready to open for the floor. So keep ready. There will be a mic circulating. So Alison is there in the middle. So just raise your hand.
Just the last point on technology again. As regulators and as legislators, I think we should not be running after technology. Technology will always precede us, and it's perfect like that. But there is a missed opportunity in the review, because we should have been creating a new category covering all aggregators of content, all distributors of content, and attaching the same regulatory regime for all. That's all.
Which regulatory regime? This is something that we have not yet managed to find an agreement on the part from the platforms that somehow should be involved. We will see if that.
Are you going to push for reopening e-commerce? Is that it?
Of course. No, but I would say, I think, you know, before doing that, we could have been thinking about on this new regulatory category of aggregators. For example, we should have been proposing obligations as regards access to networks, as regards findability of EU works, things like that.
Which is not yet there. Very good. I'm looking, yeah, Alexander, please, and then make yourself visible so that you have the opportunity to ask a question to the panelists or make a comment. It's all very free, so don't be shy.
Yeah, sorry for preventing members from the public to intervene and ask questions or make statements. It's just about a second. I'm not buying into the idea of we would not have had a discussion on platforms in the EU. I mean, that was sort of in the mission letters by President Juncker already. So we're talking about a debate which has been ongoing 3 years. And we have seen examples of how the Commission, on what they called an issue-based or issue-focused approach, have tried to deal with that. That is the video sharing platform part of the AVMS directive. That is Article 13, for example, in the copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive. That is the code, the telecommunications law review, which is ongoing, where you have that interpersonal number-based communication services, and then you have other services, so that is really up to the point. You have e-privacy there. We are debating consumer protection directives where all that plays into. I mean, I'm really a little bit hesitant in letting it flow, as you said. There would be no debate about it. There is a huge debate about it. And then we can discuss, is it wise to be acting on a more sectoral basis, or would it be wiser to open up the e-commerce directive? But my point of view is opening up the e-commerce directive, which the Commission is not feeling inclined to do, as far as I know, would render the debate more complicated, because you would have to start with the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice, which is also there, which already says if you take an active part, if you intermediate more than just mere conduit, for example, yeah, or mere hosting, then you might be responsible. So yeah, you might be liable, let's say, you might be liable. You cannot have recourse to the exemption from liability of the e-commerce directive. So that is for me a clear point where you really should think about what kind of regulatory approach, if any, is needed, yeah, which we should debate always first. Is there a
was a debate, there was a very good step.
I mean, I'm accepting that with the specific case of RTL, the Belgian regulator has a point, but you have that point since the middle of the 80s, to be frank. Of course. Yeah, no problem. And there have been given answers and answers all over, from the legislators and from the courts. So my point is, it's not true that there is no definition of editorial responsibility. You're not happy with the definition.
Not in the framework. In the case law, if you wish. In the case law.
Just to find a level where we can discuss more easily.
So you like basically the active hosting definition, the passive versus active, no? Yeah. That part of the jurisprudence. Sure. Yeah. That's, and you, Alexander, don't like that very much, I guess.
No, I was just saying there is already an approach which you can follow more down the road. And either you make it explicit in a sectoral way, which is...
It's a little bit too easy to get around.
Yeah, maybe. But if you follow a sectoral approach, as it is happening since 2 years at least, you will come to answers. My thorough is more that if you go for the e-commerce directive, you will not up with a smarter regulation after all.
And you, Colin, do you see any need for regulatory change on this, or it's okay as it is?
I think you can have debates about any directive, any regulation, what we should open, how we should accomplish goals. But I think my overall view is closer to the points that Alexander opened up with, which is in this phase of convergence, however you want to think about it. Unlike the first wave of convergence, we haven't had a strong debate about where we should liberalize, where we should deregulate. Somehow that entire debate has kind of been missed in this phase of convergence. And so I think there are many ways that you can look at the justifications for various regulatory interventions and what they're accomplishing, both at a national and EU level, whether it's a public interest premise attached to spectrum licenses, or whether it's a counterweight to concentration in the media sector or its general public policy objectives, but figuring out what regulations fit into those buckets and which of those make sense in an increasingly converged world. And I think this phase of convergence is bringing a lot of the promises of the first wave of convergence to fruit. A lot of the things that we talked about in the first wave, they haven't come to us. The increased competition that we wanted to see, some of it has come. Certainly we've made progress, but we're seeing more and more of that now. So I've been astounded a little bit in the global view that we haven't talked more about liberalization and deregulation, and about the fact that some of the obligations on Deutsche Telekom or Sky or others probably don't make sense in the world where you're partnering with VOD providers, you're partnering with us, but there isn't equal treatment of the channels that you distribute and the VOD services that you partner with or that are accessed through your service. And there's more diversity and competition, but you still have the same regulatory overhang, both at a national and EU level. And I think that that's been a surprising absence. It almost felt like a vacuum to me. But I think Alexander actually outlined it quite well, so not that much I need to go into.
Good. Now, it's your turn. The floor is open, and I hope to see many hands. Who wants to break the ice? Don't be shy. This is... Yes, I see a great person. Please introduce yourself so that...
Okay, I am Victor Castro Rosa. I come from Portugal. I represent GDIP, which is an association of national producers, audiovisual producers. My concern is about the role of producers in this whole intermediation issue. I agree that this is a trend. In fact, we are looking at cut of the middleman. So I think broadcasters have to change their roles. They have to adjust, and they are doing it. But producers, I think they are the weakest place in the value chain. I feel that there is a need to reinforce the framework that protects producers. I am talking about, for instance, copyright. I think that the current framework lacks a full revision in face of the present market situation. Producers are not very well, if we set aside the making available rights. Today we know that the communication to the public is much more than just communication, making available rights. So communication to the public is something that is today being adapted to realities, just such as hyperlinking, for instance. And we see that the communication to the right is not awarded to producers. And the very definition of producer within the copyright framework is not very well adjusted to reality. I think that someone should look into it and really have a revision on that framework. Now, another issue that has been already raised, and it's important, is that we are looking at this intermediation, in fact, when it comes to the role of broadcasters and the role of the distributors. But, in fact, when we look at the copyright issues, for instance, we are looking at the role of intermediaries being very, very well underlined, and the recent case law of the European Court of Justice makes us think that the role of the intermediary is increasingly important. I mean, content providers, I mean, search engines, someone really has to be responsible for the content that is reaching the public. And so this seems to me like a contradiction, because in fact we are watching a trend which is characterized by the responsibilization of intermediaries. Thank you very much.
Message clear. So we go back to the original problem, the definitions. So that's coming back. I know that there are Yes, also, before giving you the floor, I just wanted to invite regulators in the room, because I know there are somebody hiding around to maybe give also your point of view on the regulatory part. But before that, Jamal, a mic is, it's coming. No, you have to jump over.
I want to ask Alexander about your key principle you will defend on the debate about copyright and territoriality. Because as you know, the ongoing debate in the Parliament, European Parliament, etc., I am sure that will inspire many legislators in the region. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. My guiding principle would be what we need to have, where we have to end up with, is a fruitful, trustful alliance of all key players with a fairly balanced attribution of rights and obligations. That is the most general level of guiding principles which I would like to see reached throughout the process. That's not very precise in terms of please give me an example, but I think that should be it. This ecosystem is highly depending on every contribution of each and every player within the system. And if you have to integrate new players, which are there, which integrate sort of themselves in part, you also have to find a role for them, which means rights and obligations. But in the end, it should still be something which is prospering, which is bringing wealth, which is producing good new ideas, creative things, diversity, all of that. Yeah. And if this is your sort of benchmark also, then you can question some of the proposals which are on the market, which are there, because I think my concern is you might be overdoing in order to mitigate a situation which is perhaps present to some extent, by putting general obligations to each and everybody. That was my example of the value chain and what could be a responsibility of a platform, an aggregator like Deutsche Telekom in the end when it comes to fair remuneration of authors.
I think that politicians understand.
No, but you have.
I'd like to jump in on that.
You had been putting the question to me, and I know that you understood well.
No, I would like to jump in on that because I think the same way that politicians, I hope anyway, are keen for people generally in society to own the outcome of their own work. Every human being, has the right to sell the output of their labour, whether they are a bricklayer or whether they are a politician. And I think that creative people, it's exactly the same. That is the stories, the creativity is the output of their labour. And whether you believe in, but at least in the free market, they have the right to charge for their labour, just like anyone else. And therefore, if people are not paying them for that labour, they should be sued or go on strike or whatever other actions that workers can take in order to get paid fairly for their labour. And I don't see why creative people and their output should be any different from general workers in society. That's what politicians should be thinking.
They must be midwives.
We don't get paid, we're entrepreneurs. We only get paid when it's a hit.
Yeah. Any other interventions from the floor? We have still a few more minutes before I will ask Susanne to round up. 3 o'clock is approaching, but I think a few comments we can still take on board. Anyone?
Sorry, just a brief comment, and it's just actually to refer back to Nick's.
If you can maybe just stand up.
Sorry, Marie Hughes, producer in Ireland, was just referring back to Nick's schoolboy French, as it were. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Because I'm quite listening to, we'll say, Sky and Netflix, and what I'm hearing there are basically two hermetically sealed value chains, which really remind me very much of the old studio system. You know, which, if it wasn't for the Paramount directive, or the Paramount decision in 1948, we would have no independent film productions. So I'm just very conscious that we're just using technology to create the same behemoths that is actually very detrimental to independent film production in Europe.
Anyone wants to react?
Well, I'll respond, and maybe we could chat afterwards and try and get some figures about both the independent producers that we work with directly for exclusives and also the independent productions that we finance through co-production deals and other arrangements. I do understand the concern about recreating the studio model. I think nothing, though, gives me belief that we are recreating the studio model yet with new VOD platforms. There isn't, the talent deals don't look the same as there was in the studio model, where you'd lock up all this talent and then they couldn't work with the other studios. And so there are differences. I think the fundamental one, though, is ease of bringing content to the market. So for us, for Netflix, we faced a huge challenge because the studios were less inclined to license to us, or that the prices were going up, and so it's difficult to make our business sustainable, and so that's why we entered into production to begin with. And we've seen that same model in various other VOD services or channels that are going direct to consumer. And so my hope is that you will see there may be a hermetically sealed, to use your word, firm, but I think that that will continue to work with many independent producers, and hopefully the regulatory environment promotes more and more of those firms and not the consolidation of them. And so you have, instead of a few giants, you have multiple buyers for content.
It's a valid concern, but at the same time, there are only so many ways you can get a return on your investment as well. You know, a few new models have been invented recently that perhaps aren't returning as well as some of the people here, for example. All I would say is I don't think it's a closed system. We work with, as I said, hundreds of independent producers. We co-produce with partners across Europe and the world, enabling a lot of these independent productions to get the funding they need to be even more ambitious in what they're doing, and then it will air with different partners in different countries around the world. This is all very positive stuff, and it's sort of the opposite of closing it off and keeping it all in that old system, which indeed would not work today.
Anything needed from the regulators to help the independent productions that you would have the chance to suggest to Bernard?
Yeah, well, first, don't mess with territoriality and blow it all up. Very simple. I mean, you know, yeah. Second, do mess with the systems that are abusing content to make profit that doesn't go back to the creators, whether it be us, whether it be the producers, whether it be the artists and all the workers who work on those topics. The simple principle for me of the value gap, and also hopefully of the platform communication, which may be in our pockets now, is that if someone is using that content, they should either be paying a license for it or they shouldn't have it. These are very simple guiding principles, and if we don't respect those, then all of us have a problem.
When I will be competing for copyrights, I will think about it.
Alexander, you wanted also to briefly react, and then I think we'll hand over to Susanne for some closing remarks.
I just wanted to try to bring some of the aspects together we touched upon. I took the applause on the technology company, and that was really wonderful. Still, technology is a challenge also for a company like Deutsche Telekom. I mean, we have also to rely on people who understand much more about that. We have to buy in that kind of knowledge and technology and make it fit to our systems, to our partners' approaches and services. So that is that is partly also touching upon the issue of interoperability, but I would leave it there because I think that would be another conference also.
We're taking in topics for next year.
Yeah,
thank you.
Fine, great. One observation, if my math are still working, 40% of $15 is equal to 66% of $9, because it all ends up with $6. That was the slide from Jill, who was presenting. Okay, it's still $6 which go to the production, which is invested into production either of the models, either the old one or the OTT model. So there should be no harm, one could say, but probably it's a little bit premature to make an assessment, a final assessment on that. But I think if you look into 6 billion, 8 billion being spent by each of the companies a year on production and rights licensing, that is a number. I mean, so it should look prospective to some here. Technology and remuneration. If we as a platform put something to the consumer like instant restart, where you can go back to the beginning of a program subject to the condition that the program is still running. So you are late for the film by 10 minutes, but you go back to the beginning, but you're only entitled to do so while the film has still not come to an end. That's called instant restart with our program. I think that is of massive interest to the consumer. The consumers can find that out there by providers who certainly have not cleared the rights for that kind of proposition. But we are not able to monetize on that via the consumer. So the consumer is not seeing that as something where he would pay extra for. Yeah? And just giving that example in order to demonstrate...
All are losers, basically.
Sorry?
All are losers, the good players.
No, I think in the end, it will at least maintain the situation as it is, because you're offering a space where it is still attractive to put your content to, either as a TV broadcaster or as a VOD provider. So you still have some intermediate who is doing the contact point for your contents. Yeah? But if you then ask for, okay, they will have to pay a 20% surplus to what they paid as license fee beforehand, yeah, to the rights owners, that will become difficult. That's what I meant by an alliance. Yeah? We have to see what is feasible, and if you take risks and try to provide to the consumer something new, yeah, in order to accommodate what they might be expecting, there might also be a situation where there is no extra money, but at least some sort of stability to keep your customers.
And more content for all our eyeballs. With this, I hand over to you, Susanne, and leave you the honor to thank our speakers and panelists.
It won't take long, we don't have much time. I wanted still to walk through one or two things which I found were important. Basically coming back to the very beginning, where it was said, this intermediation, we can observe it, but it's not massively taking place yet. And I think this is also the reason why our discussion, as animated and interesting and occasionally also diverse it was, still had a lot of converging views and a lot of common positions, also because some of the panelists, of course, are already adapting, if they're not even driving forces, for that type of new convergence. So just to be a little bit clear as to where I'm coming from. I think that also underlines that there is indeed quite a need to tackle this topic, and I think this was very expressively said, that a debate maybe that should have already started much earlier. So I'm very happy if the observatory could be a little bit today the midwife for that debate, and I think that will bring in not only one child but a whole lot of them, and I'm quite sure that at this point the debate will also get much more heated. One winner of the day I also want to mention is clearly content. I mean, content is, and I should say compelling content, is what we are all after. And that's why right now also people are not that much gearing up to have this debate, because we heard this too, and I think it's very true. We have still now the old system in place and running. And the new one doesn't yet harm. So for content, it's maybe really a good place to be so much in the limelight and to pursue options. And maybe then we should not forget of not only the content side, but also what content normally also transports, which are various values. And here I'm not only thinking about the value that was mentioned quite some, law obedience, or at least, even if it's not written down in law, maybe a certain defiance to common standards, ideas, maybe even courtesy rules, something that can help everybody in the end. So there were, I think, also quite some harmony on this. The second key item, I'm not sure whether this is, it's not so much a winner, it's maybe a weasel that goes around everywhere, I'm not sure what it is, that's technology. And this is also something that we as an observatory have, of course, observed for all these years. Technology is really very difficult to nail down in all senses, so I'm not even trying to give it a very specific role in this debate, only saying that it is important, it will remain important, and it's certainly one of these accelerating things that you need in order to stimulate development, and which has a tremendous impact, of course, on the industry in whatever way. With this, I think I should leave it. I thank you really a lot for having come, for having stayed, for having participated. I particularly thank, of course, our panelists and our speakers for the extra effort. Our wonderful moderator who held up the female quota with success. But there's another... I know it's a pleasure if you are 1 out of 7 reading up and you are the one who has the say. I think she has enjoyed that. There's another female who I want to praise and thank, one that is Alison, our dear colleague, who has the instruments for organizing. Thank you, Alison. And last but not least, really also thank you again to the Bavarian host. You have been, as always, very generous and extremely professional. Thank you and have a good Christmas. And we'll be back next year at Brussels.